So thank you for coming to Plenary 1B. This session is around the technical aspects of the Kaikoura earthquake. My name's Nick Horspool, I'm from GNS Science and I'll be the chair for the session. Over the next hour and a half we've got 6 great speakers who are going to take us through a variety of technical aspects covering the earthquake source, ground motion, geotechnical response, as well as damage to infrastructure and buildings. Now the speakers today were some of the leading people in their various fields who were right at the coalface of the response to the Kaikoura earthquake, so they're going to be presenting their material. A lot of it is unpublished, but some of it has been published as well. The first up is Caroline Holden. Caroline is a strong motion seismologist from GNS Science, and she's going to take us through some of the source aspects of the Kaikoura earthquake. Thank you.
Okay. Good morning, everyone, and thank you very much for NZSEE for the opportunity to present the Kaikoura earthquake on behalf of many contributors. So I will start with some earthquake vital statistics. The magnitude 7.8 occurred just after midnight on November 14th. It lasted about 2 minutes, and 2 minutes later, we had many, many landslides, 2 casualties, and over 20 people injured. The low number of casualty and injured people is accountable to the fact that the earthquake occurred in a rather remote location and in the night time as well. About the rupture itself, the earthquake ruptured nearly 180 kilometer long segments of faults. It started about 20 kilometers south of the Hop Fault. Try to use the pointer. Okay, we'll have to do without the pointer because it's too weak, I think. So it started 20 kilometers south of the Hop Fault at a depth of 15 kilometers. So it's highlighted by the red star on the figure here. And then ruptured northeastward all the way to offshore and arrested near Cape Campbell. Okay. So in this presentation, I will go over some geological characteristics of the earthquake, followed by seismological characteristics, and then we'll have a look at the elevated seismic hazard. Okay, so first, a quick summary of New Zealand plate tectonics. New Zealand straddles plate boundary between the Pacific plate to the east and the Australian plate to the west. And also, there's about 4 centimeters of motion, of plate motion being pumped into New Zealand every year. That motion is accommodated in various fault systems in the North Island, one of them being the Hikurangi subduction region, highlighted in blue here. And as you see, it extends all the way south in the KAIKURA region. It's also accommodated by the Dixtral fault belt in central North Island, by a major plate boundary fault called the Alpine Fault in the South Island, and finally, for the purpose of this talk, by the transition zone in the Marlborough Fault system. The earthquake, the Kaikoura earthquake, happened right within that very complex transition zone that is marked to the north in the Marlborough Fault system by more Dixtral slip fault system, and to the north Canterbury Fault system, which is more oblique reverse. So it's no surprise that this earthquake, this Kaikoura earthquake, was a very complex earthquake. Quick overview of the fault rupture observation. So as mentioned in the previous talks, this earthquake was very complex and involved a world record number of over 21 fault segments. On this illustration here, we see 10 major fault segments, including the Humps fault system marked by the near the epicentral region, the Dellow fault, which has the number 2 and goes slightly offshore south of Kaikoura, the Jordan thrust around number 7 and 8, Kekirangu fault, and the Needles fault system with the London Hills fault, 9 and 10. All these faults belong to 2 very different tectonic systems, therefore making that earthquake extremely rare because due to the faults belonging to different regime and having different recurrence interval. So geologically speaking, we have a rare earthquake here. And to illustrate some of the fault observation, I'll just go over the next few slides. So near the epicentral region in the Humps fault system, we have the Leaders fault that was marked by the famous Woodchester wall with about 3-meter vertical displacement. Further east, we look at the Hundelay fault rupture, that rupture with up to 3-meter dextral rupture close to the shore. That particular fault disrupted railways, road system, and many lifelines like fiber optic cables and so on. And final illustration to the north, we have the KAIKŌURA fault that ruptured groundbreaking 10-meter horizontal displacement. And is illustrated here on the slide. The earthquake resulted in significant coastal uplift as well. So these are the numbers on the coast, marked on the coast on the figure on the screen. The coastal uplift is interesting in the fact that it's not a continuous, very smooth uplift. It's actually quite abrupt with very short wavelengths of uplift values. So when you go from Cape Campbell to KAIKŌURA, it increases to about 2 to 3 meter vertical uplift near the KAIKŌURA region. Then it decreases again and increases again south of Papatia with 2 meter vertical uplift in the Papatia region. And then close to the Hundelay fault region, we also have a very sharp uplift there as well. So it's quite a short wavelength coastal uplift that's been observed from the KAIKŌURA earthquake. And so it seems that this absence of very long, smooth, parallel subsidence pattern is not supporting the evidence for a large subduction source earthquake as well. Now that we're close to shore, I'll have to mention that the earthquake obviously generated a significant tsunami on the coast with recorded value of 2 meters in KAIKŌURA, observed value of less than 1 meter for Wellington, and observed estimated value of over 5 meters in Little Pigeon Bay in Banks Peninsula to the south. This is just a zoom in of the actual KAIKŌURA gauge station that recorded over 2 meters of tsunami wave. Okay, and I have landslide will be mentioned in more length by my colleague Sally, but I just had to mention that the earthquake was also marked by many landslides. GNS counted between 80,000 to 100,000 landslides, and 50 of them were significant enough to create landslide dams. Okay, now we're going more familiar territories. I'm going to talk about the seismological characteristics of the earthquake. Sorry, and I start with aftershock. The earthquake was followed by many aftershocks, over 8,000 aftershocks, as plotted on the figure to your left. The aftershocks were distributed in 3 clusters. To the south, you have quite a pronounced cluster that highlights the Hundelay fault, so that's the cluster to the south near the epicenter, and that goes all the way offshore, extends about 80 kilometers offshore from, it's hard to point without the pointer, but I'll try to guide you through it. To the center, you have a more diffuse pattern of aftershocks that correspond to the KAIKŌURA region. And to the north, you have a very dense pattern of aftershocks that covers not only the rupture observed in the KAIKŌURA earthquake, but also covers the region that ruptured in 2013 in the Cook Strait sequence. On the right, so the aftershocks are separated in space in 3 different clusters, but also when you look at the mechanism, which is shown in the figure to the right, so all those beach balls are showing different types of mechanism for this aftershock. The northern cluster is more representative of a dextral slip type rupture, whereas the middle segment is more representative of a compressional type mechanism. So we have a complex pattern of aftershocks as well here. If we look at ground motion was very strong near the epicentral region and all along the fault rupture, with exceeding MM9 in parts of the eastern coast of the South Island. Recorded values exceeded 1G in either end of the rupture, so near Ward and near Waio. And in Wellington, the ground motions were stronger than in Christchurch. This is mostly, particularly due to the directivity contribution of that earthquake that pushed the ground motion to be larger in Wellington than in Christchurch. Yeah, it's worth noting as well that even though the ground shaking was the same intensity in Wellington for the KAIKURA earthquake than it was for the 2013 Cook Strait sequence, the ground motion was much longer, about 4 times longer in the KAIKURA earthquake. And also in Wellington, the ground motion in the longer period was much stronger than for the Cook Strait sequence. So even though the PGA, the peak acceleration, were very similar, other characteristics of the shaking explain why there was a lot more damage from that earthquake than from the 2013 earthquake. But Liam will touch on that later on as well. Okay, source models. It's only been 4 months since the earthquake happened, but we already have a flurry of excellent source models for that earthquake. Some models are based exclusively on slip data, so on GPS and INSAR data. And that's the case of the top left figure here, which is a model derived by Ian Hamling, a very detailed slip model involving more than 9 fault segments. And that gives you the distribution of major slip that occurred on a different fault segment. At the bottom of that model, you have a model by Bill Fry that exclusively look at the time distribution, the time history of the earthquake. And then you have models that have a combination of data to constrain the models, time and slip, and that's the 3 models showing to the right. So the 3 models to the right, they're distribution of slip and time of the earthquake. So what you see is the surface projection of either the slip or the time distribution of the KAIKURA earthquake using different type of data. They seem all rather complicated and quite different, but actually if you look at the big picture, they're all showing 3 patches of main slip that occurred during the earthquake, and actually that the patch to the north was the one that contributed most to the energy release of the earthquake. So they're all very similar in that sense. And they're also showing a very strong northeastward propagation of the fault rupture on different segments, but consistently from the epicenter to the northeast. Now, what these models are not showing is that the rupture did not rupture to the south, which was, to me, it's quite surprising, considering we've had the Canterbury earthquake sequence that was quite vivid and quite active and possibly stressed out the whole North Canterbury region quite strongly, and despite the earthquake ruptured to the north. What these models also are not showing, or showing a little bit only, is that the Hop fault, which was the preferred candidate for a rupture in that particular region, did not rupture or had very little contribution in the overall source process. So these are also key informations. But the elephant in the room here is that all these models, so you remember how we saw the Hikurangi subduction system extended all the way down to the Marlborough fault system. So beneath these models, there is underlying the Hikurangi subduction fault interface. And in none of these models do we have the Hikurangi interface involved in the rupture. So the big question is, and in terms of hazard, it's a very important question, was there any subduction-like component involved at all in the rupture? So far we have tsunami data, we have coastal uplift, we also have slow slip, triggered slow slip. I will talk in the next slide or so. We have strong motion and geodetic models, but it seems that all these observations can be explained simply with just a contribution from crustal fault rupture. And so if there was any subduction component, it would have to be extremely small. However, it's not neglectable, but it seems to be small compared to the implication or the involvement of the crustal faults in the KAIKURA earthquake. And I'll go to my next part quickly because I'm running a bit late already. So we'll talk about elevated seismic hazard. So I mentioned seismic hazard immediately, short-term and long-term, and how do slow slip coming into that? Oopsie, sorry. So immediately after the earthquake, we had a lot of aftershocks in the epicentral region, or in the fault rupture region. This slide is showing earthquakes from geonet recorded 2 days after the KAIKURA earthquake. And what you see there is a big, broad zone of aftershocks right around the KAIKURA fault system. But also there are a lot of aftershocks triggered all around the North Island as well. So not only the KAIKURA region, but also the whole of the country was mostly affected by the KAIKURA earthquake. As you can see, there is a strong location of all the aftershocks in the directivity line of that earthquake as well. So this is for just short, immediately after the earthquake. Now, GeoNet publishes every month monthly forecast for the KAIKURA earthquake. So these are the forecasts for valid for March, 19th of March to 19th of April. And what you see is that the likelihood of a moderate to large earthquake, 6 to 6.9, in the aftershock region is still very high, 68%. In comparison, it means that for the entire aftershock region, at the moment, we're about 5 times higher in terms of likelihood of large earthquake than we were pre-KAIKURA earthquake, and that for the Wellington region in particular, we were 1.6 times higher than pre-KAIKURA. So the earthquake was interesting enough and gave us enough to study and to try to understand what went on, but it chose to throw one more component to trigger a whole lot of like slow slip events in the North Island. So what are slow slip earthquakes? They're kind of like normal earthquakes, but instead of occurring within a few seconds or 2 minutes like KAIKURA earthquake, they occur within a few weeks to a year time. So they rupture extremely slowly, they release very little energy, and they're only captured by a very dense continuous GPS network. So the slide that you see here is showing a cross-section of the North Island and where the Pacific plate subduct under the Australian plate, and a slow slip earthquake occurred on the interface here. So New Zealand is not unfamiliar with slow slip earthquakes. We've been monitoring them for the last 15 years. However, following the KAIKURA earthquake, the whole subduction interface went in motion and and slow slip earthquakes were triggered all over the North Island, except for that locked region shown on the plot here. So what it means is that because of those slow slip earthquakes, obviously we have an increased likelihood of large earthquakes, shallow and deep. We also have an increased loading of the stuck sources that are likely to generate megathrust earthquakes. But also we have to take into account the slow slip events in aftershock forecast and future behavior of the subduction interface. And this is currently being assessed by a team at GNS. All right, so to summarize, geologically speaking, we have a very rare event because we have multiple faults that belong to different tectonic regime and have different interval, recurrence intervals, so very rare events. Seismologically speaking, we have a very complex earthquake with recording a world record number of faults, very large surface slip, and also involved endocoseismically or post-seismically a lot of slip on the subduction interface as well. From that earthquake as well, we've learned that dynamic stressing is very important, as we've seen from the triggering of seismicity all over the North Island and from the triggering of those slow slip earthquakes. And I'll finish with an acknowledgement. Thank you.
Okay, we'll be holding questions to the end of the session if we have time. Next up, we have Liam Wotherspoon. Liam's a senior lecturer at the University of Auckland. He's also on the leadership team for KAIKURA and the management committee for the New Zealand Society of Earthquake Engineering. Liam's going to be talking about ground motion and site characteristics. Thanks.
Great, thanks for that, Nick. I'll time myself. Okay, so as Nick said, I'm going to focus more on the ground motion side of things that Caroline started on, and I will continue working through. And again, just like to acknowledge some of the contributors to this work. Probably not everyone here, but I think the key thing that coming out post this earthquake was a really good team effort across a lot of different institutions, both in research and practice, to try to leverage the most about the capabilities that we have in New Zealand. So just acknowledge all those people on the slides there, and a lot of this work is being presented today is coming through those people. Okay, so the first slide we have here, this PGA summary that Caroline showed us there, and as you can see, I've got a pointer that works, which is great. Thanks very much, person in the audience. And so as she'd mentioned, very high, so we've got PGA here, here's your scale for 1G vertical, 1G horizontal, the white points are where all the strong motion stations are, and you've got the scale there representing what was measured in terms of PGA across the network. And as you can see there was 47 motions with a PGA greater than 0.1 G that was recorded in this event, and 5 with a PGA greater than 0.5 G. And the very large, both vertical and horizontal accelerations at the initiation of the earthquake, and then as you move through to the end of the fault rupture up at the northeastern corner of the South Island. Significant vertical acceleration here of about 0.3 G at WTMC, very, very close to the initial fault rupture there. So quite significant accelerations recorded. And of course, as Caroline also mentioned, because we've got such a high density of instrumentation, we're able to learn a lot more and understand more in terms of the processes of this earthquake, both in terms of acceleration and all those other factors that she discussed. If we translate then this into an engineering context and compare back to NZS 1170.5, so the design spectral acceleration. So what we've got is a figure here. Each of these points is the strong motion stations. The different shapes show the different site class from rock through to soft soil. And then what we've done is from that assessed what was the percentage of the ULS, so a 500-year return period event that we've used here. First, we're showing it here for a 0.3 second spectral period. And what you can see is along the fault rupture, as you'd expect, you've got quite high short period spectral accelerations that are occurring. But as you move further away from where that fault rupture has occurred, you can see very quickly you're dropping down, and that ULS is looking at that 25% or below, both south and both north into Wellington. If we then shift that to a 1 second period, again, you've still got that sort of high percentage along where you've seen the fault rupture occurring. Now, you see a little bit of a difference here. You start to get a little bit of a highlighting here in the Wellington region, and I'll discuss that more later. So due to those directivity effects, and then what I'll talk about in terms of side effects, we can see an increase here in terms of that percentage as a relation to ULS. Whereas at the south, because of those directivity effects, you still see that the shaking was a very low proportion of the ULS, no matter what the site class was in that area. Again, a very good slide here showing the fault rupture, very complex. So if I take that and I look into the near fault zone, this is the WTMC, very close to that initial fault rupture. You can see north, east, and vertical. You've got over 1G in the horizontal direction, and over approaching about 3G in the vertical direction in terms of your accelerations. There's a bridge nearby that got effectively shaken off its bearing pads, which was another good verification that we were expecting this very high acceleration in this area. And you can see that it's very high intense, but also quite short in terms of the location here at the initiation of that fault rupture. If we compare that up to another strong motion station further along in terms of the fault rupture, you can see you've now got these sort of two packets of shaking that's occurred, again, because of that complex nature of the rupture, moving from one fault to the next, sort of a delay between the shifting of the rupture from one fault to the next has created that sort of characteristic. And that's resulted in both a longer time history in terms of the intense shaking, but while still having that area around where Carolina said you've got that large energy release, you also had both the large horizontal and vertical shaking occurring. If we take that and look at that in terms of a spectral characteristic, so this is the near fault characteristics here. This we've shown this for 0.4 for the site factor for site class C and D. This is not appropriate across all these regions, just it provides a bit of an indicative representation of things. You can see you've got very high short period contact in terms of the spectral characteristics in the near fault region. This is the KAIKURA record, which is a little bit further away in some of the ruptures, and it was also on rock. And you've also got in that near fault region some quite high long period content, as Caroline had also alluded to. If we compare that though to the area where the fault rupture initiated in North Canterbury, you can see that as we move further away, as we'd expect, we're getting attenuation, and so that short period component of the spectral content is reduced as you move further away, as you would expect, and we don't see that sort of increased long period component in this area, which is sort of behind where the fault rupture and the directivity is having an impact. However, if we move to Marlborough, which is along the fault rupture process, so you're starting to see some of those directivity effects, you still see the smaller short period content, because again it's still further away from the rupture, but we again start to see some of that increase or the higher long period content in terms of those spectral characteristics. If we now move to where we are now, Wellington and both the hut, and we again have got a image here showing the PGA. Here's your scale now again, so smaller peak ground accelerations, and effectively this area here is within the basin area in the CBD in Wellington. This is in the basin area in the hut area. So what you can see is you've got PGAs of up to about 0.28 G in the horizontal direction, and smaller in the vertical direction in terms of the shaking you're experiencing. So if you just sort of use your PGA as an indicator of this, these values were not too dissimilar in terms of some of the PGAs that were seen in the 2013 Cook Strait earthquakes. However, as Caroline alluded to, it was more in terms of the spectral content and the character of the earthquake and the rupture, as well as some of the side effects that caused some interesting things going on in Wellington. So if we again start to look things in terms of the spectral characteristics, here's another plot, again, where we've looked at things in terms of the appropriate site class as we currently understand in these different strong motion station locations, and we look at the percentage of the spectral content of those records compared to the New Zealand code for a period of 0.3 and 1.5, 0.3 seconds and 1.5 seconds. What you can see is for 0.3 seconds, you're not really getting these colours that are indicating we're approaching the design level, and that's to be expected. We're quite far from the end of rupture initiation, so that the short period content has attenuated out to a certain degree. But if we then look at the 1.5 seconds, we see these red colours and yellow colours are popping up at a lot of those locations, and I'll go into that into a bit more detail. If you first look at Lower Hutt, so the strong motion stations in the Lower Hutt area across the front of that the basin, what you can see there is there's a cross-section of strong motion stations across that basin, from PTOS, which is on rock, LIRS is on quite shallow deposits, and then you have a deepening across the basin where you're seeing different strong motion stations that are located there. So because these are all pretty much the same distance away from the source of the earthquake, that what we can see is the differences in what we see in terms of the spectral content of these locations is really going to be due to those site effects. And so here what we've got plotted in the red is that rock site. On the light grey is that site on the hill edge, and so the difference between those is due to that thin layer of soil at that point, and you can see this peak here, which is aligning pretty well to the measured site period at that location, so the characteristics of that shallow soil profile above the rock. And then we've got the blue and the black lines, and so the black line are these two locations here, which in a relative sense have a thinner thickness of soil deposits above the rock. But in general, you can say that there's pretty similar characteristics of the sediments across that location, such that the difference between these shallow sites and these deep sites is really going to be really due to that overall depth of that soil profile. And you can see that those spectra are pretty similar, and the main difference here is this little bump here, which is really most likely due to the amplification due to the fact you've got the deeper soil, and that deeper soil is going to be amplifying the spectra in that area. And clearly you can see the difference when you move from rock and the amplification in this range due to those site effects. If we move to the Wellington CBD area, as you can see this plot here, so each of these locations is the strong motion stations, Potts is on rock, and all the rest of these sites are either site class D or site class E in pips. So if we look at the character of, this is just in the north-south direction in terms of the records, you can see that the rock site, the peak ground acceleration there compared to the soil sites, you can see the amplification. Again, these are all pretty much the same distance away from where the earthquake occurred. You can see the amplification due to the soil profile, and also, as you'll see, because you've got this, it's sitting in a basin, and also looking at the character of where the amplification occurs, we can identify that's a combination of probably both of those that is contributing to the amplification of the shaking. Again, you can see the sort of distinct wave packets due to the complex nature of that fault rupture. If we look at the response spectra at each of those different locations, again, these are all compared back to the appropriate site class-based response spectrum. So this is the elastic response spectrum, site factor of 0.4 and hazard factor of 0.4 and 500-year return period. You can look at the comparison of the response spectrum of the earthquake records. So the blue is north-south, the red is north-south, and the blue is east-west. And you can see, in a comparative sense, the rock site, and you can see that at all these locations in the basin, you're getting this amplification between about 1 to 2 seconds, very, very clear amplification in the spectral content. We've actually, through the collation of information, identified the site period, so measured the site period at each of these locations. So the site period is really a representation of just sort of the 1D soil profile at that certain location. And this amplification in many cases doesn't align with that 1D soil profile. So it's not just the characteristics of that particular site where that earthquake record is being recorded. It's the wider context in terms of this case, both the fact that you're sitting in a basin and you've got longer period content and energy in terms of this earthquake record, which is resulting in these amplifications that are all occurring in quite similar range, even though there's quite a range in terms of the overall depth of the soil profile at each of these strong motion stations. If we then look and compare the KAIKURA earthquake with the Sedin earthquake in the Wellington region, so the KAIKURA earthquake, the significant duration about 25 to 30 seconds in the region, Sedin was about 10 to 15 seconds. Here we've got two sites, the red is the rock site, the blue is Te Papa, and the dashed line there is for the Sedin earthquake. And you can see for the Sedin earthquake and for the KAIKURA earthquake for the rock site, you've got quite similar short period spectral content. But again, as you look out into a longer period, there's much higher long period spectral content at that rock site in the KAIKURA earthquake than there is in the Sedin earthquake, just due to the nature of the different rupture characteristics of those two earthquakes and the different magnitude. Again, you see the same thing for TETS, where you've got very similar short period content for both the KAIKURA earthquake and the Sedin earthquake. But again, you can see there is amplification compared to the rock, as you would expect. There's a different sort of peak in terms of where the amplification occurs, which is due to the fact that actually in the Sedin earthquake, where that major amplification occurs due to site effects, aligns very well with the measured site period in a one-dimensional sense, whereas, as I said, you've got more of a wider sort of basin effect occurring in terms of the KAIKURA earthquake. Again, both showing that larger long period content in the KAIKURA earthquake. If we compare that to, if we then do the same thing and say, okay, well, let's divide the rock site by the source site and see where our difference, or effectively our amplification due to those site and basin effects is occurring, and we also divide our site class from NZS 11745 for the different soil classes C, D, and E, and we divide those by our rock site class B, you can see that where we're getting how that compares to the amplification due to the recorded motions versus the amplification that we would align in terms of what we've got in our code. You can see that there's clearly some differences in terms of the amount of amplification that is occurring both for both earthquakes for quite different rupture propagations, and actually for the Sedin earthquake that amplification was higher than in terms of the KAIKURA earthquake. So there's clearly some things that we can look at as we collect more information and have more knowledge to link back to how we align these things in terms of design. So in summary, 47 records with PGA greater than 40.1 G, so a significant additional data set in terms of ground motions. Clearly a highly complex fault rupture identified in terms of the complexity of the ground motions recorded in the near source. And clearly there's some basin edge and side effects that have occurred in Wellington and the Hut that warrant some further investigation. And what I've put up here is the Stats House recommendation 4, which I think really identifies what we need to do in terms of getting a better understanding using the tools that we have to try and align these back to how we can feed this into future design. So before I finish, I'll just highlight with a couple of things that you guys can link into in terms of how we can use more of the knowledge that is coming out of this data and add value to some of this raw data. So Rapid Alert Spectra is a new website that's available through geonet, which will very quickly allow you to look after an earthquake and click on those strong motion stations and show you what the spectral characteristics are, which I think is a very useful initial tool in terms of assessing where the most intense shakings might be for different building stock. There's also the New Zealand Strong Motion Database, also housed in geonet, just search New Zealand Strong Motion Database, which has a lot of, you can't read this really, but has a lot of processed records that can be used in a New Zealand context for applying in terms of design, time history, those sorts of things. And then finally, I've got my student out right now. There's a lot of good investigations being collected across all those different agencies. We've collected a lot more. So this is initial first cut site period measurements across the Wellington Basin. My undergrad is currently out there doing it today as well. And we can get a lot of these point measurements to really build up this understanding and then add more value to understand more in terms of what's going on in terms of those effects. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Liam. Okay, so next up we have Sally Dellow from GNS Science. So Sally's an engineering geologist who has 29 years of experience and has worked on a wide range of projects across landslide and earthquake hazard.
Thanks, Nick. Today, obviously, I'm going to talk to you about landslides. The landslides occurred in the KAIKURA earthquake. I'm speaking on behalf of a lot of people who are involved in this work. So that includes the geonet landslide response team, which had people from GNS Science, the University of Canterbury and Mass University, as well as the US Geological Survey and the GEAR team, and also the GNS Active Landscapes landslide team. So, going back to Bruce Pepperell's thing about situational awareness, midnight there's an earthquake, strong earthquake. I'm interested in landslides. I'm not going to know a lot at midnight, so the first thing is to try and get some situational awareness. In the first 24 hours, we knew that no one was missing. That's via the police and the fire service, because no search and rescue was required. We knew that landslide dams were an issue. There'd been a landslide dam on the Clarence River that had failed, and we also knew that there were others present on the Towie and the Conway. This is identified as a key public safety issue for the landslide response. And we also knew that KAIKURA was isolated because of landslides on terrestrial access routes. So very quickly we want to work out what's the area that's been affected by landslides. And within 2 or 3 days we'd basically worked out this map. So we knew where the severe landslide damage was, we knew where there was light to moderate landslide damage, and we basically knew where there was no landslide damage. The area of severe landslide damage is about 3,500 square kilometres. And over the process of 3 or 4 weeks, we identified 200 landslide dams. The initial estimate was that it was 80 to 100,000 landslides. This was based on a storm event in Hawke's Bay in 2011. We're using satellite imagery, and we were able to detect about 100,000 landslides. We had a similar area. We thought we'd have a similar number with the earthquake. Turned out we're probably going to overestimate that. We're going to map about 10,000, we think, with the landslide inventory. And we also had 5 landslides with a volume greater than 1 million cubic metres, so some big landslides, which we don't tend to get with rainstorms. So the first thing is, with the landslide response, was working out who was doing what. We knew that the KAIKURA Emergency Operations Centre was engaging geotechnical consultants as advisors, so property inspections were covered off. NZTA and their Kiwi Rail and their engineering consultants were dealing with the road access issues. But the landslide dams, they were the elephant in the room. How many were there, and where are they? Were any an immediate threat? We knew the Conway had failed on the first day and sent a small flood wave down the Conway River. So the process became one of a systematic search and evaluation of these landslide dams. And GNS through geonet, we had the resources, so financial and technical, the capability, the staff, and equipment to undertake the search for and evaluation of landslide dams. So that's the immediate public safety response, but we're also thinking in that immediate aftermath of what's the long term, what are the longer term thinking is needed. One thing that emerged out of Christchurch was the value of having a detailed landslide inventory to underpin recovery work and building long-term resilience. And that value was demonstrated by the Port Hills rockfall work, and that required mapping out the source, trajectory, and stopping point of several thousand rockfalls. It gives you a solid evidence base for if you're going to do zoning or land use planning. It gives you a good basis for making informed decisions. So, landslide dams. At least 200 landslide dams were identified. Some of these are quite small. They might only be, the river course might only have been shifted in a small pond form. Some of them are huge. Initially, we had to find them and make a quick assessment as to whether they were going to be problematic or not. We kind of identified fairly quickly on that there were about 12 dams that were potentially hazardous, and hazardous means they had a reasonable probability of failure, and there was a large volume of water. There was a further work going on to work out what was the risk associated with that failure, and that limited come down to about 4 dams. So we had KAIKURA at Goose Bay, where there was a settlement, houses potentially affected. We had the Hapuku Dam up in the seaward Kaikoura's, and below that we had the road and rail bridges over the Hapuku River on State Highway 1. And because the inland route became so important for access to KAIKURA, there were some landslide dams on the Conway, the Towie, the Linton, that could potentially have closed that inland route, so they became a focus as well. We talk about the number of dams under observation, but it was a very fluid number. Currently we're looking at 2 that are potentially have risk, because in the aftermath of Cyclone Debbie, several of the dams failed. So there was some monitoring installed. NZTA installed monitoring on the Hapuku because of the bridge access, the Linton and the KAIKURA. The Linton because there was only about 1.5 metre of freeboard underneath the bridge. There was nothing put on the Conway because the bridge is about 20 metres above the river. We're also, as we got new data coming in, we were remodelling the potential flood effects. So one of the things we had, a tool we had for looking at a quick assessment of the potential hazard from these dams is the landslide dam breach index, and you can see from this the Clarence Dam, and when you plot it up in terms of the upstream catchment area, dam volume and maximum dam height, that the Clarence was predicted to fail very quickly. It did. A lot of the other ones are sitting, maybe they will, maybe they won't. It looks like they all will fail. Certainly the Conway, the KAIKURA and the Linton already have. This is the Hapuku landslide dam, so it's on the Hapuku River. Again, we've got the source area. The dam, it's about 2.7 kilometres from the top of the source area to the toe of the debris. We reckon about 12 million cubic metres. We were asked to do some modelling work of the potential outbreak flood. We ran a number of simulations looking at the sensitivity. And one of the importance of actually getting out and looking at these sites is being able to measure various dimensions. So the dam height, dam width, dam area. These will have an impact on the discharge and the flow volumes. This is the one we ended up selecting as to put forward to the emergency managers. One of the things we've done, this is the Hapuku Dam still, is we're taking a terrestrial laser scanner in, and over time you can see some changes. So this is the change between the 15th of December and the 28th of March. You can see at the crest of the dam, the settlement. In this area here, you can see seepage flows coming out, with material being removed from the top of the seepage and being deposited at the toe, and you can see material being deposited in here. We're going to go back, this is taken just prior to Cyclone Debbie, when the dam overtopped. We're going to go back in the next week or so and do another laser scan to capture the differences again. So you can see on the scale on the left, the cool colours are where there's been subsidence, or the surface has dropped, and the warm colours are where there's been sedimentation. So this is just a couple of the pictures, so what the dam looked like on the 5th of December. And this is what it looked like after it overtopped when Cyclone Debbie had come through on the 7th of April. You can see there's some quite substantial changes there, and my thinking is that this dam won't survive too much longer, probably won't survive the winter. Some of the other dams, this is the one on the Leader River, a photo taken in December where the dam's blocked, hasn't overtopped, and a photo taken on 3rd of March, the dam overtopped and partially breached with a drop of about 4 metres from memory in mid-February. Interesting that there's two different styles of dams. Dams in the greywacke, so rock avalanches, disrupted rock slides, rockfall, and you've got large block slides and slumps in the softer or weaker tertiary materials. This is the Goose Bay, and this, I'll just put this slide in because this is some modelling work we did very early in the piece. We were asked to produce some modelling for the emergency services. We had to guess what the dam would be in the first instance, and we asked some people on site to give us some measurements. Turned out to be quite not as accurate as we would have liked. When we got in to measure it and redid the modelling, we got a very different result. When the dam failed with Cyclone Debbie, this is what happened, as best we can tell. So it's the importance of actually measuring the values rather than relying on guesswork. Second part of the work was looking at the landslide and developing a landslide inventory to assist with the long-term recovery and building and resilience. A good inventory is invaluable, but a high-quality inventory takes resources. So you need the funds, you need skilled people, and you need time, and you need to be able to validate what you do. So the first step was always to acquire as much source material as we could. So in that we had photography, pre and post event. We had oblique aerials. While we were doing the searching for the dams, we took photos of as many landslides as we could. We also had vertical aerial photographs. There was a 0.3 metre resolution vertical aerial photographs taken 2014 and 2015 for most of the area. We've had that area reflown post-earthquake, so we can again look at the change models. We've got satellite imagery, pre and post-event. And the thing with the vertical aerial photos and the satellite imagery is we're looking at producing digital surface models, and from differencing the digital surface models, looking at getting volume estimates for the landslides, which is something we've been looking to do, and is often very difficult to do to get it accurate. We've got some LiDAR data. We've got coastal LiDAR. We've got pre-event LiDAR for the coastal strip, and we've got post-event LiDAR for probably about 50% of the area. Where we've got pre- and post-event, again, we can do differencing, and one of the interesting things we're looking at doing is doing the differencing. How accurate is the differencing from the LiDAR versus the digital surface models? We looked at INSAR, which is a radar-based. We found it was generally too coarse. The pixels are about 400 metres squared, but could be used for very large landslides. There's one Mount Coxon that moved, according to INSAR, about 150 millimetres. So the mapping process, obviously we're using vertical aerial photographs, mapping the source area, mapping the debris, checking that against LiDAR if it's available. So there you can see the satellite imagery, the LiDAR data, and the mapping that results from it. So some primary observations. The two important rock types, so the Neogen sedimentary rocks produced a very, very different style of landsliding to the Carboniferous and Cretaceous Tallest greywacke. So soft rocks versus hard rocks, we get a very different style of landsliding. The conventional wisdom with landslides is that they focused around the epicentre. What this earthquake has shown is that focused more around fault rupture. The green dots are the landslides, the black lines are the areas where the fault ruptured, we're seeing a very clear association between landslides and fault rupture, and not sort of symmetrically around the epicentre. So this is something that we're going to obviously look at further as the inventory develops. Obviously there were some short-term impacts. The transport infrastructure was damaged, unusable. There were a number of properties evacuated because of landslides, and there was a lot of damage to farm infrastructure, so tracks, fences and water supplies. The longer term, we've got sediment movement. There's a lot of sediment sitting in the landscape now, and in particular, this is the coastal road. All the sediment sitting up on the hill here, eventually that's going to work its way downhill. It may take a decade, it may take longer. So there's greater vulnerability to landslide impacts and rainfall, and we're seeing that with Cyclone Debbie, with State Highway 1 South being closed as a result of landslides that occurred during rainfall. With all the sediment, we're also looking at increased turbidity in the coastal waters, which may affect the fisheries. Obviously, this is going to keep us busy for a few years. We've got all the work on the landslide dams. At the moment, we've only got the Hapuku and the Waima River as potentially problematic. We've got to complete the inventory work, and then we've got to do all the analysis. And we're also looking at how this earthquake has changed triggering thresholds for earthquake triggers and for rainfall triggers. We know the rainfall trigger has been lowered significantly, and we've got to get the money to do all this. So we've got lots of work in front of us. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sally. So next up, we're moving into 3 talks looking at more the impacts on infrastructure and building. So first up is David Lowe, who's the Operations Manager of NICTA, which is another new acronym we have to learn, the North Canterbury Transport Infrastructure Recovery Alliance, who's going to talk about transport infrastructure.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. Okay. Just needed to have a bit of a pronunciation test. So, KAIKŌURA. So, hope you all get that right after today. All right. Oh. Going to stay that? No. Okay, this is our founding principle, moving mountains to reconnect communities. And I won't go over the acronym again. It's a unique response to an urgent national and local need to reconnect the transport links along the Kaikoura coast. KiwiRail and NZSEE have come together as client organisations, along with Downer, Heb Construction, Fulton Hogan and Higgins, as non-owner participants to form a construction alliance. The scale of the job at hand is immense, but why I could stand here and talk to you about all those challenges, and this is where my notes go off the end of the screen. Okay, bear with me. We'll go on to the paper. So why I could describe some of the effects the earthquake has had on the infrastructure and some of the methods we're using to remediate the infrastructure. Sorry, I've lost my place on that. Okay, so content of my presentation: scale of damage, rail bridges, tunnels, road bridges, slips, other structures, and debris flow. KiwiRail's main north line has suffered over 930 individual damage sites. Some of these are cracks to concrete bridges, embankment spreading, underslips, tunnel damage, cliff collapse onto the line, and bearing damage. Some of these are also total destruction of the asset. State Highway 1 has been blocked by 10 primary sites on the highway north of KAIKURA and 32 primary slip sites south of the township. And Sally just described some of those. These slips vary in size, but the largest is 280 metres high and contains in excess of 200,000 cubic metres of material. The weather events of April have resulted in some secondary slips reaching the road and large debris flows emerging from gullies. Nectar have grouped damaged sites into 178 separate work sites in order to rationalise and programme the works. This in itself was a major undertaking. So onto the rail bridges. There are 17 rail bridges on the rail corridor that have been impacted in a major way. The image shows the effect of the vertical profile at Bridge 95, which is on the coast just north of Claverley, where the piled bridge has generally stayed put, but the embankments on either side have spread. I think that, what's that scenic train that goes along the coast? I think that will be quite interesting at this stage. So that's typical track deformation en route. I love this one, Bridge 129. I call this the skyhook, but the contractor's best friend, or perhaps the designer's load path miscalculation. This is where Bridge 129 disappears off the edge, as it were. This area has been additionally compromised because the river that Bridge 129 spans, the Tirahanga stream, no longer has a hydraulic outlet to the sea. So we've been talking, or listening rather to others, talking about the sea coming up, or the land coming out of the sea, but that's one of the net results, that some rivers don't have an outlet. And this is a picture of Bridge 129. The fault line runs right through the bridge. Piers have tipped over or moved, spans pulled from piers, massive horizontal and vertical displacement. The bridge has collapsed and requires a total rebuild. The northern end has got approximately a 4-metre lateral misalignment with the southern end, and the northern end, for approximately 300 metres, appears to have slumped in relation to the bridge. And the southern end appears to have risen. Okay, one of those bridge sites that is a total rebuild, Bridge 90. You can ask me afterwards where Bridge 90 is. Boundary stream, it's got 2 broken piers, it's an A-frame design. All of these bridges were built in the 1930s, incidentally. Continuity in the beams longitudinally, but plastic hinges on top of some piers with exposed rebar and spalling. High risk of collapse in an aftershock. So these were taken the day after the earthquake. Not a very good shot, but I think the rebar is holding that together. None of the rebar is deformed, by the way. So, demolition, early March, and then second-hand bridge beams from KiwiRail being used as emergency bridging units. New steel used for piers bolted down to the existing pile caps that had previously been inspected and certified as fit for reuse. And then the permanent replacement bridge will be a reinforced concrete ballast beam structure on new piles. 11th of April, placing the sleepers on the finished bridge and awaiting the rail track installation. And on the same day, backfilling either side of the bridge, recreating the embankments. I will say that the design here has been predicated by the availability of the bridging units. So spans are configured for the available steel rather than any other way round. Clarence River, Bridge 120, 12 spans, each of 38 odd metres. A significant structure built in 1939, 478 metres long in total. It was modified in 1976 and 2011. You might say from a distance that it actually is quite good nick. But go having a look at these supposed holding down bolts. Each of the fixed bearings has failed by not being able to take the vertical acceleration. So all the holding bolts have either extended or they've pulled out of the pier heads. And I think in that photograph you can see there's a bit of slack on those nuts. But the nuts probably wouldn't go down the thread. So we're busy replacing every single one of those. Firstly with a temporary fix-it in terms of holding the bridge down. And then we'll come along later and replace all of the bearings. This bearing sheared off and will require replacement. And you can see, if you're looking in the right place, the bent and elongated holding down bolts. Okay, so that's bridges. Tunnels. So 3D scan view in plan section of, if I've got it right, Tunnel 18. Tunnel 18 is interesting. We've been hearing about the Hope Fault. Hope Fault actually is what's shown in yellow on that 3D scan and represents the damage. It bisects the tunnel. 5 tunnels have now been repaired to priority 1. That is, they've been rehabilitated to the extent that work trains can pass through them. Tunnels 1 to 5, and the remaining works can be completed between the train movements. There are crews now working on 8 other tunnels. There are 20 rail tunnels in all to fix up. Tunnels have generally performed quite well under the circumstances. The Hope Fault intersects Tunnel 18 and has caused a 500 mil uplift of the section of the tunnel to the north of the fault. So the invert of this tunnel will have to be lowered to compensate. A transverse dislocation of less than 200 mil has also occurred. Last week's aftershocks and the heavy rain has meant that Tunnel 13 near Pekatapā is now showing signs of distress, and we're looking at actually demolishing 15 metres of tunnel and installing a rockfall shelter in that position. So just some of the challenges that we've got. Some photographs here of some of the work that's going on. Many of the tunnels are unlined. Here at Tunnel 18, the concrete lining, that's the one with the Hope Fault going through it, is being repaired. We found that none of the linings were reinforced when they were built in the 1930s. So when you think about that, they've done remarkably well. Tunnel 16, drilling for extensive rock bolting. So on to the road bridges. Was it Sally mentioned? Anyhow, someone mentioned damage to road bridges. It's been less severe. Perhaps 60 road bridges are involved, but only one, and the one shown in the picture is the Wandle River Bridge on the inland route, and that requires a total rebuild. The bridge is a 3-span hollow core structure, actually quite modern, that failed with failed piers and piles, and it's leaning over at 10 degrees. We've worked out that whoever installed the Bailey Bridge did a good job, because there's 300 mil clearance between the bridge falling over and the Bailey Bridge alongside it, so good job. Kentledge blocks have been installed to try and arrest further movement on that. Okay, aerial photograph from a little while ago. Oahu rail overbridge. This is where State Highway 1 meets the coast as you drive north into Kaikoura. Shear failure of the concrete was observed at the abutments, top of piles and piers, and some minor flexural cracking observed at the base of the piers. The repairs have consisted of resin injection of cracks, spalling repairs, and installation of structural steel shear keys. Parnassus, I think in tune with all over the country, wherever I go building stuff. Crib walls are not the way to go in seismic areas, so this is a relatively modern structure on the deviation up there. I think it was put in about 15 years ago. Significant bulging of the southwest west approach with the settlement of the road on top. So standard approach there is to in situ soil nail and a reinforced concrete, well, shotcrete facing. So fairly straightforward. This is the sort of thing that the engineers do for damage assessment. Message here is that damage to road infrastructure is generally minor. All bridges bar one I've already mentioned have been open to Class 1 traffic. So typically, where's this one? Mororimu Stream Bridge. I couldn't tell you where that was. I must have driven over it dozens of times. All these bridges you jump on and you jump off. So diagonal crack through the superstructure at the abutment, approach damage, some minor or moderate cracking and spalling at the top of the piles, transverse cracking in the superstructure, and again on the tops of the piles. So we'll be repairing these for some 18 months, I would imagine. Slips. Okay, so this is slips as they relate to the infrastructure. Said at the start, 10 primary slips to the north and 32 to the south of KAIKURA. Add to that the secondary slips, and this is the largest activity on the project. So how do we get rid of the slips? So initial sluicing by helicopter to remove the loose debris. I can say that we've had 11 helicopters in the air ever since, where are we? Certainly the start of December, if not almost the day after the earthquake. So you can imagine the cost there. Abseil access down to scale down the rocks using mechanical or explosive means, making the slope stable enough to approach from the bottom. Then we track an excavator up to close to the top, and if we can, remove all the loose material back down to bare rock, side casting as we go back down to the bottom. And in 2 locations, we're actually taking down the headscarp back to a safe angle of repose where land allows and benching down to the bottom. So slip 6, that's the biggest one, O'Howell Point, 200,000 cubic metres of material, 280 metres high. There is a smallish excavator in the bottom of that picture. Actually, it's a 45-tonner. And you can see there where we've put a bench along the top to try and arrest rocks hitting operated plant down below. We did that with a remote-controlled excavator. And slip 4, showing pulling that down to the base. 5, what that is actually showing, if you have a look left and right on the picture, you can see debris flows emerging onto the beach. So that's a feature since these storm events. We don't know quite where the debris flow comes from. Slip 29A emerged last week and completely blocked State Highway 1 South. 15,000 cubic metres of material came down overnight. I will say we're very fortunate that these things happen overnight. So we're busy trying to get rid of all of that material, but it's not without its problems. Multiplate culverts, they don't do well either. Here's the Weimar multiplate with deformity there. The work train will go through it, but nothing else will. So we believe that the main cause here of the failure is an unequal fill either side of the multiplate. How are we doing for time? All right, so I love these. Steel must have been in short supply in the 1930s because there is a bar there. It's not deformed, but it doesn't help when it's got no cover. So there's a metre thick of concrete on the walls and near that on the roof, but yeah. So we call this the Pines, southern end of a combined Kiwi Rail NZTA site, and there are 2 fault lines going through the site. And here's an aerial view of the same thing. We call this Waipapa Bay. GNS will be able to, okay. Waipapa Bay, I don't know how that relates to your faults, Sally, and anyone from GNS. Debris flow, I'll briefly touch on. It's a bloody great mess, is all I can say. And I'll take some questions at the end. Thank you very much.
Right, so next up is Peter Smith, who needs no introduction, so I'll let him get started to talk about Wellington buildings.
Just the next one here. It's laser. I'll try and catch some time because I'd like to think John can actually say something after me. Basically, I'm wanting to look at the buildings. That's a aerial photograph of the Wellington area, just for the overseas visitors. Downtown Wellington in there, the Hutt Valley stretching up through there, and Pororua. The majority of building damage was in Wellington, but there was significantly the Queensgate car park in central Hutt. Just looking at accelerations, that's pretty well covered before. The accelerations weren't great in Wellington. That's an aerial view of the downtown Wellington. The port area is down through here where several buildings were quite badly damaged. There's also a zone up through there which had quite bad damage. Keeping a city running, that's been covered pretty well this morning, so I'm going to jump through that. Some of the things we did do was to form an engineering leadership group straight after the earthquake. That was representatives of most of the larger firms in Wellington, and that system worked really well to get information about building damage into a centralised centre, and something we then had a full awareness of the sort of magnitude of the damage that was going on. That triggered off the Wellington Targeted Assessment Program. It was primarily dealing with flexible concrete buildings, typically up to 15 stories, with precast floors. The precast floors turned out to be our Achilles heel. Often they were sited in areas of shaking amplification. The characteristics, significant loss of contents or non-structural damage. That's your first identifier that the building has actually had severe shaking, and signs of significant movement. One of the big problems we faced was that as you went into some of these buildings which had floor damage, because of carpets, etc., the damage wasn't obvious. Again, that's showing the targeted buildings, those buildings that were looked at in the central Wellington area. Again, you've got, it's not working, the ones down the waterfront. The buildings that were significantly damaged were Statistics House, which John here will talk about very shortly, the BNZ Harbour Quays, Defence Building, Rivera House, Molesworth House. Molesworth House was an older building which had a severely cracked column at one level, which I think interesting to reflect on in Christchurch with the one of the buildings there that had a bad damage. A series of engineers and contractors went into the building and secured it. This one was much less damaged, but it was seen fit to be demolished because it wasn't safe to do any work on it. The Reading car park in downtown Wellington, and finally the Queensgate car park. That's very quickly the Stats building. That one is the Harbour Quays. You'll notice these aren't tall buildings, and they're also quite modern. The Defence building, again, not high, but relatively new, more medium and certainly not high-rise. Precast floors were used in New Zealand from about the mid-70s. It was done for speed of construction and obtaining longer spans. There were ribbon infill type systems, there were double T sections, and there were hollow core flooring systems used. Typically with a 65mm in situ topping with non-ductile mesh reinforcement and only concrete to concrete bond between the topping and the precast units. Buildings, especially the more ductile, were up to 3.5% elongation. Of course, if you've got these units passing more than one bay of the building, you end up with a lot more elongation. And the more ductile, I think, the more you get more extension. That demonstrates the location there where the extension of the beams at the first floor in particular starts to tilt the ground floor column and extend the flooring system. There's possible movement of the external columns away from the floor plate and becoming potentially unstable as a frame. There's connection to secondary type elements that are a concern. That's a typical level of damage we're seeing in some of the what we call beam hinging. Not dramatic like you get in the laboratories with multiple cracking, often just a single crack, and yet it still caused quite significant beam elongation. That one there showing again how you've got the cracking in the beam, but you've also got spalling of the support of the precast units and diagonal cracking in the corner of the building. So the issues are there's damage to the precast units at the support, particularly in the corners of the building, damage to the support seating, cracking of the hollow core units beyond support, and also longitudinal cracking of the precast units. Corner cracking, that's looking down at the corner. You can see how there's multiple cracks across the corner of the building. Another one there, the corner of the building's in the bottom right of that photograph. These hollow core units have got no reinforcement other than tendons in the base. That one shows the transverse cracking, the support lines just beyond the pipes there. So we've got cracking at a distance out from the beam, which a simple support angle won't support. Another one there showing the sort of typical cracking and also picking up on a longitudinal crack in one of those units. So the transverse cracking is probably the biggest concern because it is occurring often outside the support line, especially in hollow core. It's, I think, affected by some concrete infill into the ends of the hollow core sometimes, by the starters that go over the top of the hollow core and the development of the tendon strength in the hollow core over the end of the unit. Again, an example there of some of the cracking that's present longitudinally. Some double T's with longitudinal cracking. That was a sort of a intermediate support that damaged those units. Longitudinal cracking there of the hollow core. Supported double T's, a lot of spalling, not only of the seating but also of the double T unit. You can see there that the support has been removed or reduced to a very nominal level. Moving on to steel structures, because they weren't exempt. The Queensgate car park was probably the significant steel structure involved. It's a two-storey car park with a cinema complex. I'm sorry I don't have a nice architectural picture of the building before demolition. That's being taken during demolition, but you can tell that it's got 2 stories of brace frames holding up probably about a good 2-storey of cinema complex above. And that's essentially the structural system. And I hope everyone from Christchurch is looking, because if you don't restrain the braces, then they soon find a way of relieving themselves of load. And that's what happened in that building. They break the cleats and the connection of the braces to the frames didn't restrain them adequately. Precast panel fixings, we had issues with problems with those, and you'll see in that photo, construction tolerances didn't end up with the bolts being centrally placed in the slotted holes. The targeted assessment, as it was touched on before, it's a balance of whether you occupy these buildings after an earthquake or whether you require them to be vacated. It needs precaution. There's public safety issues involved, and we need to be very careful in that period. The targeted assessment was to address public safety issues really and to provide confidence that the appropriate engineering investigations of buildings had been undertaken, that where necessary appropriate repairs and remediation were being implemented, and utilising emergency powers under the Civil Defence Emergency Management Act to achieve that end. The results of that targeted assessment, interestingly, there were about 70% or 45 of those buildings were ductile concrete moment frames, so clearly our main concern. There were 14% or 9 concrete shear walls, 13% mixed, or 8 of those buildings, and non-ductile concrete moment frames were only 2 buildings, 3%. In terms of the hollow core and double T's, you'll see 65% involve hollow core, 8% double T's, 19% ribbon timber infill. Significant damage was in 11% of the buildings. There was structural damage distributed across the building in 11%. There was local structural damage of 28% and isolated floor unit damage in 7%. There was no identified structural damage in 43% of those that were checked. URM, well, of course, the surreal situation in Wellington was these old URM buildings, all earthquake prone often, performed without damage, and yet our modern buildings were tested. I just touched briefly on the fact that as a society with the CSOC and other technical societies of IPENS, we managed to get an initiative underway for securing of parapets and facades. And I'll call it quits at that so that we can hear from Duan.